Anika Cooper. Anika Cooper will be joining us at 2. David Engstrom. Claire Evans. Chai Feldblum.
Here.
Susan Sui Grunman is not joining today. Janice Hoffman. Dan Ho. Renee Landers.
Here.
Hi, Renee. Tristan Levitt, alternate Joel Alexander.
I'm here. Thank you.
Thank you. Bob Lesnick. Jeff Lubbers will be joining us in about.
No, I'm here. I made it.
Oh, you're here. Wonderful. Yep. Welcome, Jeff.
Thanks.
Alex Manuel.
Yes, here.
Tom McCarthy.
Yes, I'm here.
Melissa McIntosh. Patrick Nagel. Roxanne Rothschild. Bob Schiff. Sean Vitone. Chris Walker. Judge Lesnick will be arriving later. Melissa Wasserman. Melissa should be joining us a little bit later. David Welch. And Russell Wheeler.
Here.
Perfect. Great. The only ACUS member or non-member of the committee I have down is Bill Funk. Bill, are you here? Don't think so. Did I miss anyone?
Hi, this is Claire Evans. I joined a little late.
Wonderful. Welcome, Claire.
Thanks.
Great. Back to you, Nadine.
Thanks. Thanks very much. We have a small group today, but we'll make good progress, I'm sure. Matt, did you have anything you wanted to say?
No, a small group does allow more progress, but no, thank you, Nadine, and thanks for, it's good to see everyone. And it's a small group, but it's a good group, and I don't want to stand in the way of your getting this done maybe by 1:30 or so. So back to you, Nadine.
Wow, that's optimism right there, 1:30. I'm going to run through very quickly the drill that I have to run through. Many of you know this, but for those of you that don't, only ACUS members, government members, public members, senior fellows, liaison representatives, and special counsels, whether or not are on the committee, and their designated alternates have full speaking privileges. And we have an alternate, at least one today. To avoid background noise, please keep your microphone on mute, and you can use the hand raise feature in Zoom, or you can add a comment in the chat feature if you would like to speak. I'll call on you, you can unmute, say your piece, and then remute when you're done. Please do not use the chat for substantive discussion, just use it to indicate that you would like to speak. With respect to any attendees other than ACUS members and alternates, participation requires unanimous consent. Time permitting, I'll consider calling on you at appropriate points, and we will presume that everyone consents to you having your say, absent raising an objection. So please, again, indicate in the chat feature or by using the hand raise feature, and then wait to speak until I call on you, unmute, remute when you're done. Chat feature, again, I've given you that warning already, no sidebar discussions there. And then if we get to a vote today, which I'm not sure if we will, only members of the committee have a vote. Do not vote unless you're a member of the committee, and we know who you are in case you're not sure. So we will update you if you need that. I hope everybody had a chance to look at the updated draft that Jeremy sent out. I think most of you will have noticed it now includes a preamble, which I can only speak for myself, I think is very well done. I would rather wait to look at the preamble until we're through the recommendation, because I think we made some good headway on the recommendation last time. So there were some edits to the sections. Jeremy had to remind me where we left off. We made it through recommendation 7. Is that right, Jeremy? So to the extent that there were edits to those recommendations that we've already been through, I think the version that I have printed out was largely committee on style. There were a couple comments that we needed to discuss. So before we turn to that, any general thoughts on 1 through 7, or should we just go right to the specifics? Okay, good. So the first comment that I see is in recommendation 1C. Sorry, there's a comment from Jeff. I apologize. I don't have that in my. We could start with that one if anyone has any objections to that edit from Jeff. Russell?
I'm at line 53. I thought it was ACUS policy not to tell agencies to obey the law. Am I missing something? And agencies should adhere to constitutional statutory requirements. You can fix that by saying agencies beyond adhering to constitutional statutory requirements should consider. I'm just remembering past discussions when ACUS staff said we don't typically tell agencies they have to obey the law. We assume they will.
That rings a bell to me, but any thoughts, Jeremy? Do you recommend?
Yeah, as so the only change we made here was changing recommending a change from be attentive to adhere to. As I recall at the last committee meeting, the concern was that agencies may not even be aware that there are constitutional principles, especially that are relevant in this area. To make it clear that agencies should consult attorneys on First Amendment principles before formulating policies in this space.
And I agree with everything Jeremy said. I'm not sure we have sort of, as a general matter, I think Russell is right. We don't typically, recommend agencies follow the law, but there may be instances like this one, where Jeremy has flagged, if it's not well known, that it's worth, highlighting. Though I, of course, defer to the committee, and if we prefer something along the lines that Russell suggests, I think that works as well.
The one thing about, if I may here, I agree with everything Reeve said. The one thing that Russell's suggestion does do, and it might be tweaked a little bit, it does kind of explain the relationship between the constitutional and statutory requirements and the benefits or the policy considerations, whereas the current formulation, in my mind, doesn't necessarily do that or doesn't do it that well.
What's Russell's proposal?
Right.
It would be on line 53, agencies, comma, beyond adhering to any constitutional or statutory requirements for public access should consider the benefits of. Beyond adhering is a little awkward. Maybe that was.
But in addition to adhering.
That's fine. That's better.
And this is Chai. I'll just say, I think that makes sense. And I think it was good that it got moved out of shall consider Constitution, et cetera, up there. And I think this sends the message to agencies. Obviously, you need to consider that. I mean, you need to make sure you're adhering constitutional and statutory. And by the way, here are the other things we're recommending.
Yeah, I think this looks good. It sets the First Amendment as a baseline or a minimum, and then says beyond that, having satisfied, any legal concerns, then you can address the policy questions.
That's great. Thank you. Thanks, Russell. Okay, we'll move on then. Jeff's comment to just change agency office to agency hearing room. I think we can accept that one. We have an open question here on C, whether it should say proceedings or open proceedings. Is that right? Yeah. Any thoughts on that?
I have a more general observation, a very quick one, if I may offer, before we get to C.
Sure.
The preamble makes reference to, I know we're not doing that yet, but the preamble makes reference to people might want to have a family member, friend, or personal care attendant, caseworker, other supportive member of the public present. I don't see in paragraphs 4 to 6 or anywhere else in these itemizations any reference to any possible exception to authorizing such individuals to be present at otherwise closed proceedings. And I may have missed it. And if I didn't miss it and it's not there for a reason, that's fine too. But I just thought to raise the point that nowhere does this recommendation seem, other than the preamble, to recognize that could be, I could think, a fairly large class of parties who would benefit from having a caretaker there and they have health challenges or something else. If I missed it, I just recede. If I didn't miss it, though, I just offer for the committee's consideration whether there ought to be somewhere some recognition that there could be an exception for that group.
Jeremy, do you recall if that, I don't recall that it's mentioned. I think we stayed pretty broad, right, with members of the public, and we tend to keep it broad.
It is broad. I defer to the committee. I think it's a great point. That's obviously an important consideration, which is why it ended up in the preamble. But if there is a way the committee thinks it's advisable to put that in the recommendation, it's a good point.
Well, when we get to paragraph 2, I'll have a possible, or I could raise it now, any way you want to look at it.
Let's wait and get to paragraph. Let's just resolve quickly this proceedings issue. Does anybody have concern about open versus just proceedings?
Fine.
We can wrap that up and then move to your point. Renee.
I just have a question. I mean, people can be aware of, the public can be aware of proceedings that are not open. So I think I would just leave it unqualified.
That was my sense as well. Any other thoughts?
I agree, and I think the Sunshine Act sort of takes the same tack. Closed meetings have to be at least announced.
Yeah.
As an analogy.
Okay.
I agree.
Great. So we'll leave that as proceedings. And I think there's one other spot where we have the same answer then. Okay. So recommendation 2, is that where, Russell, you were thinking?
Well, yeah, I don't know exactly in what order it would go, but something along the lines of guidelines set forth, maybe whether presumptively closed proceedings may be open to specific members of the public, such as family members or caretakers. Throughout the recommendation, which I think is well drafted, I don't have any general criticism of it, but there is a notion of the public as one undifferentiated mass.
That's true.
And I understand that, but there may be a few places in which that has to be treated with a little more nuance, such as the one I suggested here.
Russell, can you repeat that language? Added as an I, you said?
Well, if you want to make it HI, letter I, whether presumptively closed proceedings may be open to specific members of the public, such as family members or caregivers.
Renee, I see, does it relate to this point? No? Okay. We'll resolve this, then I'll come to you. Any thoughts on that language? All right, we'll leave it in. I think it's a great point, Russell. Renee.
So in A, paragraph A, A on this in part 2, where and how agencies will communicate the schedule. Again, it says open proceedings, so maybe we want to just say proceedings and not open proceedings there. And then what was the language that Russell just proposed? What was that again? I maybe do have a comment now.
Can you see it on the screen there? It's under I. Highlighted. Renee, you're like me. I'm like this.
I know, no, it's because it's too small, but now I made it bigger, so it's okay. So is specific, this is the question I had, is specific the right word or is select the right word? I don't know what the right word is there, but that's not a big deal for me.
Okay.
I just thought I would mention that.
Do we want to replace specific with select? Russell, do you have a reaction to that?
Either one's fine with me.
Let's do select and we can, there, okay. So let's go back up to A. Is that a spot where open should come out? Is that what the suggestion was? Is the idea there that you're communicating it so that they can attend? So maybe open is the correct.
Of course, B
is open. Yeah, is all of this assuming that the proceeding is open? The list.
says it in every one.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I think it makes sense because this is about giving information. Who should you contact if you have questions? You know, whether they need to register. I think it's fine here.
Okay.
Well, you could put in the leading
Yeah.
part of to set forth in plain language the following information about open proceedings.
Right.
But then I think Russell's I might need to be.
Yeah.
Can we scroll back down to see I? Oh, no, I think it's fine.
That's okay.
Yeah, that's fine.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry. Can we give that to the Committee on Style so that we're not repeating open proceedings in every single one if the idea is that these are all assuming an open proceeding? I think we could do that. Okay. Okay, great. I think we're okay with Jeff's addition. Any other thoughts on the list? A through I now. Okay, great. So 3, there were no changes. 4, Jeff has a comment here. Well, it's just making it plural. Hi, I'm sorry, I just noticed you.
No. I just have a request, accommodation for those of us with poor eyesight. Can it be blown up just a bit? Okay, even that. Okay, now I can read. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you. Plural is fine, I assume, with everybody. It's great. Good catch. We also had the addition of statutory, I think, yeah, there it is, which is consistent with how we say it above, right? Okay, our list, A through F. Jeff had a comment.
I just felt that D, participants' privacy, needed some kind of qualifier because, of course, every participant has privacy, and you can't make this, a loophole that will close every meeting. So, serious privacy concerns or serious privacy. Well, yeah. I mean, somebody's got to decide whether they're serious, of course. Participant can't just say, I've got a serious privacy concern. Well, what is it? I mean, so I don't have the exact language in mind, but.
Hi, do you have?
I think that's a really good point. I'm not sure, maybe something like unique privacy concerns, like the person makes the point.
Special
privacy.
Special
privacy concerns, that works as well.
Renee?
Or, particularly sensitive privacy concerns or something like that. Particularly sensitive information. I'm not coming up with the phrase from like HIPAA, but, because that's the idea that we want to convey.
Judge Manuel?
How about to include PPI, to include but not be limited to PPI, but if there's a witness, for instance, in the transcript, that would be disclosing their social security number or address or something, maybe that's something that you would not want to have, would need to be redacted before there be certain disclosures made.
That could also be added to C.
Yeah. Joel?
We sometimes use the phrase, it's in FOIA also, the unwarranted invasion of personal privacy, something to that effect. That gives a little bit of a word on which to judge that privacy violation, if you will. And that does cover, I think FOIA uses that language for PII and the like.
Judge McCarthy?
I was just looking at Themstric's rule concerning privacy considerations. It says that persons submitting information to the commission shall protect information that tends to identify certain individuals, to constitute an unwarranted intrusion of personal privacy or disclose confidential commercial information in the following manner. Social security numbers, financial account numbers, driver's license numbers, other personal identifying information. Minor children shall be identified only by initials. I think PPI kind of covers it. I mean, I think we're trying to identify information that constitutes an unwarranted intrusion into personal privacy. Tends to identify certain individuals. I don't have any suggested language, but I thought that the comment might be helpful for others to perhaps assist me in identifying that language.
Russell?
The problem with the way it's stated now is it's inconsistent. There's national security, law enforcement interests. Those are presumably good things in a limited way. Invasion of personal privacy is a bad thing. And I'm struggling as everybody else with a way to phrase it. Something like personal privacy. Um, well, it goes back to what Peter was saying before, some way to indicate that not just any kind of personal privacy, but yeah, something like that. As somebody's right there, personal privacy interests. I mean, I get the unwarranted invasion part. I appreciate that, but the list, if the list that way, it's discordant. Interests of minors is a good thing. Personal privacy interests are a good thing you want to protect.
Mm-hmm. Hi.
Yeah, I was gonna suggest going back to something like sensitive personal privacy. I'm fine with especially sensitive personal privacy interests. I don't think the PPI piece is as relevant. And again, I'm thinking of an example of, something that would ordinarily be open, but someone has some specific sexual harassment or some other, the subject matter is particularly sensitive. So I just wanted to speak to that it's not just they're identifying information, but something that is particularly sensitive.
And personal and yeah.
Right.
Any thoughts on this? I think Judge McCarthy, follow up?
Yeah, so what about along the lines that Kai was suggesting, what about like prior criminal convictions or there's information that you don't want to be out there in the public domain, and there has to be steps taken to ensure that it's not out there.
I think something like that would fall into this category. Yeah, it's a good point.
You might say personal privacy interests. Again, I'm just drafting on the fly. That outweigh the interest in transparency or something like that. That's poorly worded. I apologize for that, but
That's in the lead-in part of this, though. You go up a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I saw it.
Yeah, that's why I had raised my hand before. The whole point is something that presumptively would have been open, but now here are the things that might outweigh the interest in transparency.
Yeah, that covers it.
Yeah, national security, law enforcement, etc.
Any further thoughts on this language? Thank you, Jeff, for flagging it.
Okay, but let's take out that outweigh the
Take out everything after privacy.
Right.
after interest.
After interest, correct.
Okay. Anything else on the list? I think we are good to go on the list. Anything in the following paragraph through 5? I think a lot of this is just wordsmithing, committee on style.
Yeah, this section was previously one long 5-line sentence that was remanded to the Committee on Style to clarify.
Russell?
Oh, it's the same point. Are we in 5 or are we still in 4?
We can go to 5. I think we're good. 5.
Again, we're line, is it 107? It was. Agencies should adhere to First Amendment. That same formulation that someone suggested earlier that avoids telling agencies they need to obey the law.
We can reconcile.
I can't remember exactly.
It. Yeah.
I suggested something and Jeff suggested something better, but it was in addition to, I think he said, in addition to adhering.
We can make it consistent. Yep. So we had Jeff's addition in 107. Anything on that, Jeff?
There should be an and there.
Yes. Yes. Okay. So we have our revised list below A through F.
Can I just say something real quick?
Sure.
In the preamble where we mentioned these different phases of the case, I suggested reordering them just,
Mhm.
but also raised the question of whether investigatory hearings are ever open. I mean, maybe this is something for the authors of the report. Are there situations where investigatory hearings are open?
Indeed, and in fact, most of the litigation we found in this area centers on investigatory hearings, which are quite often closed, but in which there is quite often public interest. So yes.
So they're often closed, but you think that they ought to be open more often?
That is certainly been the subject of litigation.
Can you give an example of the type of
Sure,
investigation?
sure. Mine Safety and Health Administration investigatory hearings preceding the issuance of a complaint have traditionally been closed, but we found several instances in which media groups sued MSHA to open those proceedings, and in some cases prevailed.
I think some agencies might have a problem with that, but
I think they would, and that was exactly that's what resulted in the litigation. In some cases, the agency was not successful. In other agencies, the agency is granted the request to open the proceeding. Some agencies do have, I think the CPSC, for example, its regulations routinely open investigatory proceedings to the public. So there is variation, and there is public interest.
Judge McCarthy, I was
just going to ask Jeremy if that was like related to terrible mine tragedies that killed several workers, and there was so much press because of that, and whether the Reporters Committee Supreme Court decision addressed this issue, because I can't recall.
On your first question, yes, that's exactly right. These are terrible mine disasters that then there is massive amounts of public interest and press interest in covering the investigations that may result in an enforcement action against a mine operator.
I would assume that would be true with OSHA too. Nadine?
Probably, although, you know, yeah, probably.
But it's not true of grand juries. Just to be the devil's advocate. I mean, you know, if this may, I don't know how others feel about this, but for recommending, we seem to be recommending opening investigatory hearings. Or are we just saying that agencies should consider opening investigatory hearings? I mean, there may be a difference there, but I think a lot of investigatory things are closed, and
At least as we intended, recommendation 4 takes the default that evidentiary hearings and appellate proceedings should be open. For 5, it sets up, there are lots of other kinds of adjudicative proceedings. Agencies should consider whether they should be open to the public. Here are factors to consider deciding whether or not to open them without putting a thumb on the scale.
that's fine then.
Hi, did you have a comment on this?
Actually, that's fine. I mean, what I was going to say is I think it is important for agencies to think about opening those investigatory hearings, even if they haven't. They may choose not to, but I think that's something they should be thinking about.
Russell, did you have a comment here too?
It's a word comment. It goes through most of them, where we say that, especially since the parenthetical above now has 2 things in it. The reference to that, I found the reference to that type confusing as I read it. unless everybody is sure that they understand that that type means typically closed proceedings. It's a mouthful, typically closed proceedings other than evidentiary and appellate proceedings. Whether public access to proceedings typically closed, you see my point, that type, the antecedent is now pretty unclear because we have two references in the parens up there.
Do you even need should it just say whether public access would promote?
I think that'd be fine.
Is it clear what we're talking about already?
Should the parentheses, the such as, come after that are typically closed in 5 also? So that solves that a bit too.
No, I think, yeah. And then throughout the list, we would take out proceedings of that type. To the extent that that makes sense in everyone.
Yeah, I think that's fine because the way it's set up in the main paragraph, you have to be pretty dense not to realize that what you're talking about.
Uh-oh, that one we might need it. Yeah, I'm not sure in C.
Whether such proceedings.
Or the broader adjudication. Hi, did you have your hand up again for this?
It was just a short one on 122, maybe conform to what we did before in terms of privacy.
Oh, good catch. Yes. The participants' privacy language there.
Yeah, right. Would it be a confidentiality sensitive?
Yeah, just to make it.
Yeah, just conform, especially sensitive
Right.
issues of privacy, whatever it was.
Good catch. Okay. So I think C, we've taken care of that. And then we have a comment here from Jeff on D and E and whether they should be combined.
And also, if you don't combine them, D should be such proceedings also. Take out of that type.
Mm-hmm.
But it seems like they're pretty overlapping, D and E.
Jeremy, any thoughts on that? Were they meant to kind of target different things here?
They were, which is not to say that they have to. By broad public interest in E, I was referring to adjudications in which there is a public interest standard, that the matter being adjudicated affects the public interest or the interests of persons beyond the parties, whereas D was getting at members of the public may just be interested in the proceeding because it involves a newsworthy event or a notable personality. But those don't necessarily have to be distinct.
Jeff, did you have any ideas for combining them so we could take a look?
If they're separate enough, I guess they both involve public interest. You could put them in one paragraph and just put an or there.
Hi, did you have a suggestion there?
Yeah, I just wanted to speak to maybe just keeping it as is, because I did sort of have, when I read it, a sense that D is, there's often public interest in observing such. That's about the type of the proceeding, like maybe it's OSHA, maybe it's whatever, as opposed to E. That even if people are not ordinarily interested in that, there is, as Jeremy said, either a public interest standard or interests of persons beyond the parties. So I think, Jeff, you're right to have highlighted the fact that these seem to be overlapping, but I think once we've articulated how they are slightly different, it just might be easier for agencies if we have them separate. I don't feel strongly. You can also combine them and do an or, but I
I don't
think,
feel strongly, I guess, either, although, D might involve some, public figure or something that people are interested in, the Britney Spears conservatorship, I mean, but I don't know. I guess it's not a big deal.
I am looking at recommendation 72.1, which is where I drew some of this language from. It does talk about adjudications in which a public interest standard is applied. I don't know if that's a helpful change to E.
That's kind of limiting in a way. I think it's better the way it is. I mean, because we don't really know which types of adjudications involve applying a public interest standard necessarily.
I hear leaving them apart for now.
Okay.
Nobody feels strongly enough about combining them. And I think the explanation Jeremy gave makes sense. I just didn't know if there was maybe a better way to make it more distinct, but maybe that's good enough what we have.
Well, on F then, on F, when I read this, as I say, I'm not sure which way it cuts, whether or not if the public can easily obtain this stuff, there's no need to open the meeting, or because the public already can obtain this stuff, the meeting should be opened. Jeremy, what did you have in mind here?
To me, if you're already going to open part of the proceeding to the public, there isn't necessarily a good reason to restrict it other than perhaps availability of resources or space or that sort of thing.
I mean, the Supreme Court takes a different view on its proceedings.
Right, which is very true.
and we don't necessarily like that.
Right.
No.
I think I have my perspective, but I will defer the committee on what you all think is best.
I'm trying to make it more clear, that's all.
Sure.
Is there language we can add there?
You could say whether the proceeding will later be made available. Well, that doesn't really change it. It's sort of getting at the idea that there isn't necessarily a strong privacy interest for the agency if you plan to disclose it later. It's hard to say that this is private information when you will later make it available on your website.
It's a little bit like the Freedom of Information Act cases where the government says this should be restricted and the requester says, well, it's already been written about in the newspaper.
Exactly, yeah. Although in this case, the agency will later be publishing it versus a newspaper.
Yeah. Well, if it's clear enough to everybody else, I withdraw my suggestion.
We do need to, we can say such proceedings there for consistency, get rid of that type. Yeah, the only other thought that came to mind, I'm sorry to come to this, is whether, whether members of the public can already or can, it pretty much says it.
But I do think it does, I mean, if people in this group had a question about it, I think it does raise the issue that other people who haven't been involved in this drafting are not going to be sure which way this cuts. And so I think we ought to try to clarify that somehow or drop it. I mean, because there's something to be said for being, as they say in Hamilton, being in the room where it's happening, as opposed to like reading about it later, Joel,
did you have a thought? You're on mute.
Thank you. I wonder if you can make it negative and say whether the copies are not available. I don't know. I'm trying to make, and I agree with the point that it is, I don't know which way out, if I would have read, I mean, I don't know which way I would have gone, like you said, of which way that policy cuts. And I'm trying to think, maybe it could go, make it negative or something to that effect, where whether members cannot already access it. I don't know. I'm just trying to figure out, maybe that's another way to do it. I can't quite get the words down.
Hi, did you have a suggestion on that?
Less of a suggestion than saying what Rena was going to said, which is we clearly can't say which way we think this cuts. And I'll just say, when I read it, I thought it was cutting in the way of don't open it because they'll be able to obtain it anyway, as opposed to, oh, go ahead and open it. So I definitely read it that way. And so I guess it's also a policy question for us. Maybe that's the thing for us to grapple with a bit. You know, if we think that the transcript is going to be available anyway, do we think that makes it more or less of a reason to open it? It's interesting. Well, when I read it, my instinct was, yeah, you don't need to open it. They're going to get a copy of the transcript. And I'm thinking about it as a policy matter. I'm leaning more towards, look, if you're going to have the transcript available, why are you keeping people out to be in the room to hear it? So, but I do think we need to clarify it. I do think we need to clarify it. I don't think it's particularly clear, because in all the others, it's inherent in them. Is it going to affect persons beyond the parties, you know?
Renee, did you have a thought on language here?
Well, I did. I mean, it's sort of a concept that we could try to embody in language, which is that if the availability of transcripts, recordings, or summaries of the proceedings would satisfy the public interest and transparency, blah, 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 you know, our whole laundry list of things, you know, something like that, whether that would satisfy that public interest. And so, because then you could say, well, maybe the answer is no, and that you have to open the proceeding anyway. So that's just a thought about a way to frame it. I don't have the specific language, though.
Whether the public interest would not be satisfied by the inspection of, et cetera, et cetera.
No.
That might.
Judge Manuel?
Yeah, I was just kind of toying with the language too. I sort of thought, I don't know if you can come at it from this direction, but whether agencies can or should help facilitate public disclosure by keeping the proceeding open to the public. I mean, the goal is helping to facilitate public disclosure, whether they can or should help facilitate that process. In some cases, they will want to have public disclosure. Some cases, they won't.
What if you put in simply by the inspection or merely by the inspection? If we're trying to sort of put our thumb on the scale of openness.
And maybe it's disclosure of, or no, the disclosure of, yeah.
Yes. And just following up on what Jeff just said, I had been thinking would not be sufficiently satisfied as opposed to satisfied simply. So that's just another alternative.
I think that's closer to where we're trying to get here. Jeff?
No, I think so too.
Is that helping? Yeah.
Yes.
Any small point?
Yeah, go ahead, Russell.
Oh, you need to say copies of, I mean,
Yeah, that's what was bothering me there.
my copy of my Federalist Papers that it has a copy of the Constitution in it. And I thought, oh darn, I thought it'd be the real thing, you know?
I think we've got it here. Thank you for raising it.
Inspections of recordings is a little awkward, but
I thought disclosure. I was trying to think of Judge Manuel's point about disclosure, but I'm not sure if that quite works either.
Or public availability or access to.
By access to, yeah.
yeah.
There you go. Transcripts, recordings, or summaries.
Who says we can't draft by committee?
Yes.
I don't know. I still go back to Reporters Committee decision and the balancing that the Supreme Court did there years ago when CBS asked for the FBI files on, in an overly broad fashion, the FBI criminal files on a specific person. And I haven't read it in a while, but I don't know if, Jeremy, if you looked at that decision when drafting this and what your recollection of the balancing is there under FOIA, that the court clearly came out in favor of privacy versus FOIA exemptions from public disclosure. Sure, I'm muddying the waters here, but
So I think Tom's making a good point here. This is closer to what we intend, but does it also maybe send slightly the wrong signal to the agencies here? Are we saying to the agencies, you know, you should think about making the argument that you don't have to come be present at this hearing. You can just read the transcript. I don't think we want agencies to be taking that point of view. But it does seem to be an invitation to the agencies to make that argument. You know, so I think we need to take a step back and see whether this undercuts some of what we're trying to do.
So I wanted to respond to Judge McCarthy's comment because in 4, you know, we have a list of things that would mitigate against openness and including, you know, things like national security and law enforcement interests. And so I actually am sadly not familiar with this case you keep talking about, but I'm now planning to go look at it. But it seems to me that, you know, the FBI files would fall into that law enforcement area. And so, you know, I think this is not what we're talking about here. I think we're talking about everything else that might be an investigation, but it's not in the same way a law enforcement investigation.
Yeah, I understand that. That's a good point. But I think as I looked quickly at the Supreme Court's decision back in 1989, it actually turned on the specificity of the request as opposed to its broadness. And I haven't read it to review our discussion today, which is why I want to go back to Jeremy and ask if any thought was given to how that decision cuts in this context, because it implicates the media, FOIA, privacy, and the public interest standard. And the court came out in favor of protecting privacy in that context based on the narrowness of based on the broadness of the request. So I think perhaps we need to look at the specificity of what's being, the specificity of what the proceeding is dealing with. I don't know.
Sure. On Richmond newspapers, I'm going to punt to my co-author, Mark, if I can.
Are we, Tom, I'm sorry, are we talking about Richmond newspapers here, or are we talking about Reporters Committee? I thought your concern was more reporters committee, which I'm happy to talk about briefly.
That's correct. It's reporters committee.
So my understanding of reporters committee is largely tracks with yours, which is that it turned on two issues essentially. One was the breadth of the request made in that case, and the court essentially held, if I'm remembering correctly, that the request for criminal records was so broad and so it lacked any kind of, you would have gotten all of the criminal records for the subject at issue there, and that was too broad in light of the balance that FOIA was supposed to strike. And then you mentioned the media issue. I think I recall that in that case, the court held that there was no special privilege based on the fact that the requester was a media organization as opposed to a private party, for example. Those are the two things that I recall reporters committee standing for. In terms of how it factored into this particular recommendation, the short answer is I'm not sure it did. And perhaps you think it's a good idea that we go back and reconsider, the committee, I should say, go back and consider whether adopting a recommendation focusing on the breadth of the information sought or the breadth of the information sought to be disclosed. That's certainly kind of, but I don't think, and Jeremy, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but in drafting this thing, I don't think that we viewed it from the standpoint of the reporters committee.
I think, Mark, that's consistent with my rather limited understanding of that case, but it seems to me that it's bringing all these factors together here, and it would be prudent to go back and take another look to see if we're missing anything when we're listing these factors here. That's all I'm suggesting. I don't want to go down a rabbit hole that we don't need to go down. But
Jeff, did you have a thought on this?
I'm starting to think that we should drop this paragraph because I think it's might send the wrong signal. I mean, if what we really mean, I think, is something like whether the public interest would be completely and unequivocally satisfied by access to the transcripts, et cetera, et cetera. And it's really hard to draft this, in a way that doesn't kind of make it too easy for agencies to say, oh, you don't need to attend, here's the transcript.
Yeah, and I'll just add that the intro language to the list says consider at a minimum the following. So to the extent that we're struggling to capture this point, perhaps we not include it. or we rethink how we want to present it. But I think that was your suggestion, Jeff, that maybe we just drop that paragraph.
That's my most recent suggestion, yes.
I mean, what do we lose by dropping it, I guess is the question.
I mean, it reminds me kind of a discovery dispute. We're telling the public here, this is good enough for you. We've determined that you have access to transcripts, recordings, or summaries. And they say, well, it's not good enough for us. We don't want that. We want what we want, which is essentially what CBS and the media said in Reporters Committee, or what the discovery rules provide for is broad access, even if it's available otherwise. You still have a right to check against other sources of discovery. I don't know. I think Jeff's onto something here. I think it needs more work, and I'm not sure I'm being helpful, but it's troublesome to me.
Well, the suggestion that we delete it, does anybody have an objection to that? Given that the list is not meant to be exclusive.
I'd say, Nadine, I'd say just to drop it.
All right, we'll delete it. All right, thank you. Let's move on then to 6. Another list. We like lists in this recommendation. Any concerns on 6 and its list A through F? Nothing. Okay, we'll move on. 7. So we have a comment here that we were to discuss this at the outset of this meeting, which of course it's past the outset, but Jeremy, do you recall what the discussion was at the time? Because it is not coming to me.
I believe this was Bill Funk's concern that we were saying that in all cases, we should provide remote access.
Okay.
Um,
Okay. Because 7 is about being in the room. 8 is about virtual.
right.
And this language was put together by the committee on stylish to kind of address that, or was this
No.
Bill's
The red line
This was
in
Bill's
8.
language?
The red line in 8 was left over from last.
Got it.
meeting.
Thank you. Thank you. Chris.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is really watered down now. I mean, either agencies should consider providing, or agencies should, when it serves the public interest, provide, right? I kind of like that better than consider. Maybe just say should provide, but leave in the when it should serve the public interest.
Any thoughts on that? Bill is not here today, right?
I have a question. So, how does 7 and 8 work in tandem? Like 7 suggests that, you need to provide the opportunity to be in a room, which triggers, the ability to see everything that a person in the room can see. Obviously, one would think of credibility determinations that an adjudicator may make because of based on demeanor or seeing everything in the room. 8 suggests that you should provide the opportunity to observe remotely. And are we saying you need to do both, or are we allowing, is there some conflict and we're allowing, I guess we're saying they need to do both, but can 8 swallow 7? Can the agency use we provided the remote access and we think that's good enough and we don't have to provide an opportunity to actually be in the room? And I'm not sure. So I asked the question if there's potential conflict between the two. What are we asking the agencies to do? Provide both, provide either or what?
I read it as we're looking at flexibility here for the agencies. Jeff, did you have?
Well, Tom kind of beat me to the punch on this. I think we need to create the relationship between these two. So something like when it's not possible to conduct open proceedings, or as an alternative
I think it could be both. Why can't it be both? I mean, there's some people.
It can be both, but it also shouldn't be used as a way to avoid open proceedings when open proceedings should be held or can be held. I mean, you know,
I guess I read it as the idea is that sometimes there's the ability for people to be there in person, and sometimes some people can't be there for travel, whatever. So there's remote access as well, but that opens up a door to certain things that I think we tried to talk about last time. That's coming to mind.
Also recall that a lot of proceedings are increasingly not held in hearing rooms, they're held virtually. So 7 wouldn't even apply in those cases, and then 8 would be the only option for public access.
But what if both options are available? Are they mutually exclusive, I guess? Like
So,
go ahead.
I was gonna say with 7, the way we structured it, and this is not, again, this is up to the committee, it's when proceedings are conducted in person, when proceedings are conducted in person, provide in-person access, regardless of whether they're conducted in person or remotely, provide remote access.
Russell, did you have a comment on this?
Just to keep in mind the point that was made earlier in the last meeting, that it was specific of immigration removal proceedings, is the impracticality of providing online access to every one of those oftentimes 5-minute chop, chop, chop proceedings held in detention centers. I don't think when it would serve the public interest captures that, I thought, well-taken practical objection to the assumption that anything that happens ought to be available for anybody in the country to be able to observe if they have access to a video screen.
There are, and I think we talked about this last time too, there are multiple ways in which remote access can be structured. It may not make sense in immigration proceedings to say, we are live streaming every single immigration proceeding, go to YouTube and watch everything live, versus my mother is in a proceeding, I can't attend with her, can I have a dial-in number so I can listen into her proceedings, so I can be there with her? There are different ways we can talk about remote access here, and one of those might make sense for immigration proceedings, the other might not.
I have a suggestion here.
Go ahead.
Why don't we make these two parallel? Number 7 is just when adjudicators conduct open proceedings, this is how they should do it. Why isn't number 8, when agencies provide members of the public the opportunity or do remote proceedings, such as by doing this, they should do it in the following way. I mean, then we wouldn't be getting into the question of, you know, one versus the other.
When it's appropriate to do one or the other, or both, yeah.
I like that. I have a question though about Russell's concerns in 7. I don't use a public hearing room for an immigration proceeding. I mean, doesn't it provide an incentive for perhaps an agency not to use a public hearing room if they don't want it open to the public? Do we need the words in public hearing rooms?
Oftentimes they're held in detention centers, which are not open almost by definition.
And hopefully as structured, 8 would detract from some of that sort of line of argument where you're saying, fine, we're not going to hold it in person because we don't want anyone showing up. Recommendation 8 then says, well, fine, but you can still provide remote access. So yes, I think in the past, before remote observation, saying we're holding this in a small conference room, we can't facilitate public spectators, would have been a great way to avoid public observation. Paired with, but you should provide remote access, takes away some of the power of that argument.
The only question, I guess, is on line 51, 152, provide, it goes to your point, Jim, provide members of the public, suggests it's open to everyone. That doesn't really, that's not the same as what you were saying, is some family member wants to observe a removal proceeding that nobody else in the world really much cares much about.
I mean, you could say provide all or select members of the public.
Something like that.
You could say a dial-in number on request or live streaming.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah.
Paragraph's awfully long now.
Yes, I think the Committee on Style will have its work cut out for it.
Anything further on this?
They should consider,
Go ahead, Jeff.
well, I was going to say they should consider the following. I don't want to say considerations, but and then we have a list
We
here.
could have a list.
We should-
Because we don't have enough lists in this recommendation.
Actors.
No, that's good. Anything further on this? I like that change. That's a good change. Okay, let's move on to 9. Anything further here? Okay. Ten. Do we have it? I'm sorry. Do we have an issue there with open again in line 170? No. No?
In the heading also.
Yeah. I think to be consistent, Judge McCarthy, did you have something here? Oh, you're mute, yeah.
We want to say agencies should consider, or we want to say agencies should provide. I mean, don't we want advanced public notice in publication of this? Isn't that what we're encouraging? I mean, we don't want them to consider it, whether it would be beneficial. We want transparency and advance notice of this, don't we? It's open.
Well, I think, so if we take open out, it may not be open. Right, because we talked earlier about that with the Sunshine Act. Am I remembering that?
Okay, sorry about that. Maybe it just seems a little.
How does it square with what we had when we made the change earlier? I'm sorry. It wasn't that long ago and I've already blanked it out. Requirements, if any, for advanced public notice of proceedings, see paragraphs 10 through 13. So we took out open there. There was open, was there. And we are on 10 through 13. So to be consistent with that, we should take out open, right?
You could bifurcate it and say agencies should provide advanced public notice of open proceedings and consider whether to provide advanced public notice of
every proceeding.
All proceedings or something like that.
We don't need and publicized them. Isn't that the same as advanced public notice?
Mm-hmm. Can we try Jeremy's language? I think that's an interesting thought.
I like Jeremy's language.
Sure. So agencies should provide advanced public notice of open adjudicative proceedings and consider whether, we could just say whether to, or whether it would be beneficial to provide advanced public notice of all other adjudicative proceedings, which would be closed proceedings. Or proceedings that are not open to the public or open to public observation.
Tom, did you have another comment here? Your hand's up.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't take
Oh,
it.
no, no,
I'm
it's
just
fine.
wondering why we're bifurcating in the first place, but I like Jeremy's suggestion. But why are we making a distinction about advanced public notice?
I think if you didn't, you'd basically be saying that the Social Security Administration should provide advance notice of hundreds of thousands of hearings every year that are not open to public observation. In some agencies, it makes sense to provide public notice of closed proceedings, and in others, it may not.
That makes sense to me.
Okay. Anything further in this paragraph? I'm trying to see if our change in the opening line impacts anything we're saying later, but the Committee on Style will find it, right? The Committee on Style will find it. I think it's fine. 11 and another list. I kind of liked the reference to a newspaper. It seemed very old-fashioned. I don't know that we would ever put something in a newspaper, but
I think some statutes require it.
that's interesting to me.
Yeah. But it could be an online newspaper.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Judge McCarthy.
In the last sentence before 11A, why do we have the word open there?
Mm.
In light of the change we just made above.
Yeah, and we have it in 177 too. Any concerns? Russell?
The word, line 179, the word can, it almost sounds like we're giving permission. Might.
Anything further here?
I don't see TikTok mentioned anywhere in here.
I mean, social media, is that, I don't know. I'm a dinosaur. Is that considered social media? I have no idea.
Yes.
Is it metaverse or is it still Facebook? Sorry, just a little levity.
I think we've covered the universe pretty well here. 12, should we move on to 12? Do we have anything further on 11 and its list? 12. Comment from Jeff here.
Yes. I was just thinking about registration. I mean, we don't really have a recommendation per se on registration, but I can see why if you're going to do an online presentation, people need to register, just like we have for this one. But in terms of someone coming to a in-person proceeding, are we saying that they should always have to register? Do we want to imply that they always should have to register beyond, what they have to do to enter a federal building? So that may be too restrictive when it comes to in-person proceedings.
Would it work to say along with requirements, if any?
That would help.
So Jeff, you also raised the security question, and I think Judge Manuel raised it as well.
Just occurred to me that if we're giving all these pointers on how to deal with how to organize open proceedings, we might want to say something about security,
Renee?
both in terms of, you know, how people behave in the proceeding and what might happen if somebody misbehaves, things like that. I don't have a pre-written recommendation, but it just seemed relevant.
I was going to speak to the preceding discussion we were having about requirements for registration. Maybe if we just said procedures for registration, because then, you know, an agency may have some requirements sometime for, you know, for online participation or whatever, but we're not suggesting that, you know, that requirements are necessarily a good idea. Because I agree with Jeff, somebody ought to be able to, if they can get into the building, they ought to be able to go kind of anonymously to the proceeding if they want.
So you would say procedures, any, along with the procedures, if any?
And yes, but you know, I recognize that there's proceedings and procedures in that same sentence.
Instructions, or I guess we've said instructions later, but maybe that's useful.
Yeah, something like that. Directions. Yeah.
Judge Manuel?
Yes, I agree that Jeff's point about the security protocols, I think, is important. As you know, there's a lot of attention being paid to that now at the ABA and many other groups in terms of judicial security, but just security in the building in general. But also, I was thinking that basically anything, a member of the public who wants to come to the proceeding, anything that needs to, where they should be put on notice that if complied with some requirement, they could be turned around at the door. They may not be able to enter. And so for sure, that includes, like, for instance, COVID protocols and a mask. If you just happen to not bring a mask, they may not allow you into certain buildings. So that's kind of what I was trying to look at here in terms of what things we should put them on notice of so that they won't be disappointed and not be able to enter the proceeding, the hearing room.
Renee, did you have a follow-up here? No, okay. Yeah, I wasn't sure if this was the place to mention security, because is the idea that you would be including in the public notice that there will be security are we thinking in the room to get in? I would think that's covered by how to access the facility, instructions for accessing the facility. Judge McCarthy, did you have a thought on this?
I had a thought, I don't know where it leads us to, but oftentimes the agencies are borrowing facilities. So they need to know up front from the borrowed facility what the requirements are. It's not always within the agency's hands. They're subject to both the facilities requirements and the state and local requirements, particularly during COVID, of, you know, what the protocol is. So I don't know how that cuts, but it's an observation I think is relevant here.
Is there any language that we need to include on C right now? Is there another spot? Is there any further changes to C? Okay. So D,
Maybe we could just say security protocols or something like that in here. In
Yeah,
C.
that's, I think, what if we, well, I'm sorry to go back to C since I just said we weren't going to do C. There's no reason, is there any reason to include it there? So instructions for accessing the facility where the proceeding will take place, including any security protocols. Does it fit there?
I mean, do we want to say any security or public health protocols? I don't know. Or is that?
I like that. I'll have to say, I agree with Judge Manuel that, you know, obviously COVID-19 protocols are what's top of mind for everyone right now, but it would be lovely to have this kind of live past that and not have to mention it specifically. And maybe just public health protocols is enough to put a pin in it without, I don't know. I'd like to think there'll be a day where we won't be thinking about this. What, so Judge Manuel and Jeff, you both kind of raised these points. Does this help accomplish what you were looking for?
Yes, I think so. And the other one that I just thought briefly, because I thought there was a mention of this somewhere else earlier, but again, I keep coming back to it, when you show courthouse, you have these surprises, like if you bring your cell phone, for instance, that might not allow you entrance into certain buildings, or you have to go back to your car or something. But so I was just trying to get at some of the things that might be an impediment to someone gaining entry or access.
I mean, one security protocol might be that if you disrupt the proceeding, you will be quickly ushered out by the officer in charge, something like that.
I think this is broad enough to alert the agency, you know, think about these things. What is the person showing up at the doorstep going to have in place and do, right? That should be part of the notice that you give. Judge McCarthy.
Yeah, I think that's right. My concern is that agencies have to do some legwork before they provide the notice, and whether we want to address that agencies should determine this stuff with the facility itself or wherever they're going to have the proceeding. I mean, I think it kind of assumes it's an agency proceeding and agencies have control, but they don't. That was my point. So there's legwork that they have to do to put it in. I don't know if we need to say it. I throw it out there for your consideration. I mean, I think these things are important, but in order to get there, agencies have to do the homework to determine what the requirements are for the particular facility that they're using to hold the hearing.
I think that's a different recommendation. I mean, I think this is all about, you know, public notice and public access and telling the public things. It's not so much a recommendation to the agencies about what they should think about when they hold hearings and whether the hearing room's adequate and whether, you know, there's enough of an airflow and there's a security officer on the premises. That's not really the purpose of this recommendation, it seems to me.
Recommendation 9 also gets at some of that in the case where maybe you have unreasonably heightened security protocols, which actually act as a barrier to public access. So that might get at that point as well.
Joel.
Yeah, I'll echo that one comment about, I mean, we have hearings on military bases, we have hearings in prisons, I mean, that is, to have that information, I mean, I know to have that information in all our public notices and make sure that's all, you know, that's going to be quite a bit of work, and maybe that's fine. Maybe that's something we need to do for each one, because they may not have public access to defense bases and the like. To be able to have that, we'd have to do the other way, but that's an interesting, you know, interesting additional amount of information that we'll have to gather for every single hearing that we have.
And I guess, the other thought is, I think Judge Manuel included disability accommodations as well in that last. And whether, yeah. And then we could delete the last, does that make sense, Judge? To build it into that?
Don't forget number nine, paragraph 9 covers a bunch of this stuff, as Jeremy pointed out.
Okay. Anything further? Where are we now? Oh, you were going up to 9. I'm sorry. I got lost there for a second. 13. Are we ready for 13? Are we done with the list here? I think these are all good changes. I mean, I hear what you're saying, Joel, that, I mean, some of it is, your own personnel are going to have to know how to, right, access these facilities. So it's something you're going to have to find out, but maybe it has to be more detailed.
I had to think about that for sure, because I just think about maybe contact information on acquiring that information. That might be the way instead of it being in the notice itself.
Yeah. Call this person to get all the information you need to know about getting in. Yeah. 13. I had one. Oh no, you go ahead, Renee. Renee, please.
Oh, this is a style comment. More advanced notice may be warranted. For example, if significant public interest is likely, to get rid of that "there is likely to be" phrase. Yes.
Thank you. That's great, Joel.
And maybe cancellations as well, or modifications of those schedules. Sometimes, like if you have the notice that there's going to be an open hearing or an open proceeding, we need to make sure that because we do change ours a lot also. So it gets out of date quickly too, even the day before, So I'm not sure if it's not just notice of the open proceedings, but maybe changes or modifications or updates, something to that effect.
Mm-hmm.
Because we get a lot of courthouse steps settlements,
Yeah, no, I hear you. I'm trying to think of a way to build it into that first sentence. Or does it need to be a separate line? Can we give that to the Committee on Style and add?
Sure, it may need to be a separate one if it
It may
applies
be a
to,
separate one.
because it might actually apply to 11 and 12 in part as well. It could be agencies should communicate any.
How about just providing and updating?
The appropriate timing for providing and updating.
Public notice.
Let's try that. Oh, I like when it's an easy fix.
This is the Committee on Style.
Yes. It's a very good point. Thank you, Joel.
Maybe one of you please give me that language again. Making a note of preparation.
Providing and updating. Was that what the suggestion was there? Yeah. I had one thought just on the end there, to observe in person instead of it. Maybe that's unnecessary, but we are talking in this section about notice. And maybe because we say open there, it'll be clear what we mean in person, but. And I guess, do we want open there?
Probably not, if you want to leave time for people to say object to closure.
I think that's something, I mean, to the extent when you go back through this, that, yeah. Something to keep in mind. What time is it? Oh, let's try to get through 14 and then we could take a break before we get to the preamble. That will be the prize at the end.
I have a suggestion. Can you just go back to the last one for a second?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it should say on second to last line, if significant public interest in an open proceeding, because that sentence only applies to open proceedings, right? Because we're talking about traveling to observe in person.
Yeah. I think that's right. All right, let's get to public access to transcripts. We have a comment. Well, is there anything before D?
Small point on line 217,
Mm-hmm.
strike carefully. I mean, I do this all the time, but it presumes the default is carelessly weighing it.
Yes.
I have a broader 2 points. I don't know where they fit, and one may apply to 16, but they both had to do with the press. One is whether we say, just advise the agency that once you make a recording available, the press may use it. That may scare people away, but I think the general assumption is once it's out there, the press can use it, including excerpts. It's not going to happen often, but it can. And the other refers to new point 16. It says provide recordings in a timely manner. That's pretty squishy. For big cases, you want it to be provided immediately. It goes back, the Supreme Court said, we'll provide recordings of our oral argument back in the dark ages before they moved into the first part of the 21st century. And the press said, well, it's not doing it's good to have the recording available on Friday. We want to use it on Monday, the day of the oral argument. So something other than timely manner, it seems to me, both of these are concerns, I think, for the press. And I have some specific language I can suggest, but I just want to get those two on the table, and you may want to go through it more particularly.
So I have a problem with the word whether on the second line. Agencies should consider whether to make how they make transcripts and recordings available. Because of the note, the FACA section 11 says that agencies shall make available to make transcripts available. It doesn't apply to recordings, but I don't think they necessarily have the discretion. Maybe they can wait till somebody asks for one, but I think they have to make transcripts available, don't they, Jeremy? Or Mark?
Yes. Yeah. Yes.
Well, I think, does it go back to the timing issue? I mean,
What about just saying how? Take out whether and.
And also the other issue with FACA is FACA doesn't require agencies prepare transcripts. It just says once a transcript is prepared, an agency has to make it available. So lots of the proceedings we've listed, for example, settlement conferences may not be transcribed.
Right.
Investigatory hearings may not be transcribed. So as an initial question is, what are you transcribing? Once you've made that transcription, then FACA requires you to disclose it.
So
What is a transcription? What does this transcription mean, Jeremy? I mean, if a agency just records the proceedings and doesn't prepare a contemporaneous transcription, what is that? Is that?
That's a good question. I looked at that. I couldn't find any litigation on that. Certainly in non-FACA contexts, courts have occasionally found recordings to be transcripts.
Judge McCarthy?
I guess Russell's point, Matt's point is, in what type of expedited fashion or how quickly do they need to make it available? For example, certain agencies may have a recording made of a oral argument and it's not available for technological reasons for a week or a month. It's certainly not quick enough, right? And I think Russell was advocating for, and perhaps I'm wrong, I thought he was advocating for, perhaps certain parties need expedited transcripts made available immediately. And I think usually agencies impose a cost requirement for an expedited transcript.
Yes, and FACA has been interpreted to allow that.
Well, I know less about this than anybody else on the call, but if a proceeding is recorded, there it sits in whatever form it is, why can't it just be made available immediately? Or alternatively, if the proceeding is being being broadcast, as it were, if you can tune in and get it, what's to stop any press outlet from recording it on its own and making use of it?
Yep.
And you want to say anything about that? I mean, it may be opening another can of worms, but I think agencies ought to realize, in my view, A, that this is going to happen, and B, that they have an obligation to facilitate it rather than try to discourage it.
15 gets at some of this issue. In some cases, material will have to be redacted, and that will obviously take some time. It may not take a lot of time, but at least there needs to be some time allowed for any necessary redaction before disclosure.
Well, but again, I'll shut up after this. If you're able to tune in and just listen to it live, redactions don't do any good. I mean, because somebody will have captured it. The agency may say, well, Commissioner Jones misspoke. Well, it's too late for that. That's just the way it is.
Right.
Right. If it's not recorded and it is transcribed,
Right.
there may be some. So if the proceeding is closed for public observation, it's being transcribed live, there may be some time necessary to redact any sensitive matter before disclosing the transcript.
this might be a good topic for an ACUS project, actually, because there are a lot of issues here.
Yeah.
I mean, can members of the public bring a tape recording into an open meeting? If not, can they record a Zoom meeting and then, make it available? I mean, and then what exactly does FACA Section 11 require? So I think there are a lot of issues here.
Yeah, and what's the meaning of the word can? I mean, how can you stop them?
Can I just ask too, so this whole recommendation, the 14 doesn't say open, right? So it just says transcripts and recordings of proceedings.
Yeah, and Zoom creates a transcript
So
automatically.
but I guess as far as the concern of someone being able to drop in remotely and capture their own audio, we're not qualifying this, right? It's just any proceeding? Or are we focused on how?
This may be a topic for the preamble rather than the regulations, but I think it's another one of those things in which the technology has outpaced the debate. I mean, again, it's not directly applicable. You go back to the Supreme Court, which said for so long, you know, the sky is going to fall if we ever provide simultaneous access to our oral arguments. Well, they pretty well had to do it once they did it on Zoom. Couldn't tell the press well it's out there because they tap into it somehow. So we make it available. And now, you know, all of a sudden, you know, the press is making copies of the oral argument, making transcripts, capturing the Zoom proceedings and broadcasting it. And the sky hasn't fallen either last time I checked.
Well,
I think it's a big, it's a big question.
Nadine, I was going to say, I think agencies have rules about whether other recordings can be made. Usually it's prohibited. And I think the problem is that some agencies don't have sufficient manpower to get the recording or transcript out there in a timely fashion, even for judges within the agency. I've had problems getting a transcript of a recording of an oral argument within 3 weeks or so. That's a problem. That's a manpower issue. That there's not sufficient staff to get it out there. And Russell's raising a really good point. I mean, we want it today. If you're in complex litigation, you want an expedited copy of that transcript the next day before you go into court. So I don't know. But that's another problem here, is insufficient agency manpower to keep up with the technology.
This might be a part of this recommendation that we just don't have enough of a foundational report for yet. And, you know, we can just
I mean,
mention,
clearly,
mention that FACA requires this, but in the preamble perhaps, but that.
well, I'll just add too, I mean, maybe this is obvious that, you know, the public has access to all of this through FOIA, any agency record. So are we talking here about how this dovetails with open proceedings or something else?
I'll tell you what I'm talking about is the occasional high visibility proceeding, high visibility perhaps within a small community, in which the press has an interest, and an interest that's not going to be satisfied if something is made available in a few days, because it's you know how that beast works. Wants the stuff right away.
Well, and that's not a new problem.
No, it's not. But the new technology has contorted it.
Yeah, I mean, I think the concern you're raising is, so if you have an open proceeding that is accessed by the public virtually, I mean, in person, to the extent there are restrictions on what you can use your phone to do in the courtroom is one thing, right? So you can't capture it. You're maybe taking notes, but, you know, to the extent that you want a transcript or a recording, if you're doing it virtually, you can hit record on your phone. Nobody knows. This is the problem we talked about, I think, with the last recommendation, right? I mean, the last project of the committee long ago.
Well, maybe Jeff's solution is the best one, is simply to say that this is a thorny and fast changing matter that's worthy of further investigation, and we're not going to get into in this recommendation. I don't know if that comports with ACUS policy, but
I'm wondering if, Nadine, I'm wondering if there's some way we could, it's hard to imagine us, I mean, I agree with everything that's said. It's hard to imagine us sort of undertaking a separate project on this very discrete issue. I wonder how far we could go in this recommendation on it. I suppose also ACUS's office of the chairman could do something by way of follow-up on this subject. It's just hard. Jeremy, maybe you have some thoughts here, but it's just hard for me to imagine sort of a cleanup project on this and maybe a few other discrete issues.
Yeah, I agree. Unless it is of uniquely great concern to agencies and the public. But I haven't seen that.
True.
I remember going to a negotiated rulemaking meeting at the Department of Education, and they were saying, you know, recording is prohibited and all this. And what would happen is during a break, people would tweet out everything that happened in the meeting. And there was no way to control that. And you know, the department was frustrated by that. And that was a few years ago. So now,
Yeah.
now in the pandemic, when lots of things are on Zoom, as Nadine said, you can just record it.
That said, and this was a big part of our interview process, since so many agencies really do have recording restrictions in place, and I think everyone we interviewed basically said that there is no great way for the agency to enforce public attendees at home who are watching by Zoom. There is no way you're going to know if they're recording or not. That said, no one reported any videos showing up online, for example, or being used to intimidate or harass. So it may at this point be more of a theoretical issue than a real world issue, which is not to say that at some point it could become a real issue, but at this point it seems a very theoretical one.
But there's also the issue of what exactly does FACA Section 11 mean? You know, so if somebody says you've had a proceeding, I'd like the transcript. And the agency then says, well, we don't have,
FOIA.
we haven't prepared it yet, or
File a FOIA.
yeah, or all we have is a recording. Or
there were some OMB guidelines issued in the wake of FACA, which basically got into the idea of what is a reasonable time in which transcripts have to be provided. I'm not sure that guidance is very relevant today, just given changing technology and changing practices since 1973. But there is some guidance on that out there.
and the odd thing is that this is in FACA, but it applies to any proceeding.
Right.
So it's not just the FACA committee transcript. A lot of people don't realize that. So
Yes.
I think Matt, there might be enough of a project here, maybe for the office of the chairman, but I think a lot of agencies are probably at sea about this.
I can only speak, obviously from my experience, but, we have a thriving, as an adjudicatory agency, we have a thriving, pretty robust FOIA system. And, the parties get the records because they're in the system, right? But the public wants, for instance, our big SeaWorld case where the trainer died and the public was all over OSHA, all over the OSHA case, which was pending before our judge, and wanted things immediately. We had videos of the poor woman being drowned. I mean, all of that had to be reviewed for privacy. We have Privacy Act considerations. It's not that anything isn't available. We can make things available subject to those restraints. It's a timing issue, right? The public has access to all of our records, transcripts, recordings, emails.
But FACA specifically addresses only transcripts. So, and it specifically says it's at cost. So the FOIA fee issue gets trumped, at least with respect to transcripts, by FACA, it seems like. But the question, well, how much can we say about this in this recommendation is really today's question.
Okay.
Well, I think, don't we want to say that timing is the issue? I mean, we all know how long FOIA can take,
yeah,
how long it can be delayed out. And I'm going back to Russell's point about agencies need to keep up with the technology. So we want to encourage them to be able to get it out quickly, I think. Maybe they don't want to, though. I mean, they can get out an expedited transcript. I mean, I've tried a huge NLRB case where, the respondent was getting an expedited transcript the next day because they wanted to know who testified today so they could prepare for tomorrow.
Well, and they pay for it, right? The party pays for that expedited service.
Right, and we got a copy of it expedited because they paid for it.
Yeah.
But, right.
But you paid extra to get it expedited, so that was the cost. And so it was at cost, according to FACA Section 11.
Now, they paid extra to get it expedited, and we got a copy out of fairness, I think, if I recall correctly. But right, there should be a procedure where you can pay for the recording the next day or pretty quickly before the agency, in a rather dilatory fashion, gets around to posting it on its website.
But that's only for transcripts, not for recordings.
Well, it's an open question whether a recording is a transcript. There's at least one.
Is it?
Yeah, there's at least one treatise online that says that for FACA purposes, a recording should be treated as a transcript. I'm not going to treat that as law, and I don't think it's based on anything more than just case law in other areas. But I guess it's at least an open question.
Well, I suggest we take a break and put a pin in this, and really maybe we could take a few minutes to just pause and think about it.
What time are we coming back?
What time is it? Let's do 10 minutes. So 10 after. Has anyone had any great revelations? I have one, but I'm not going to share it until I see if anybody else has thoughts about how to proceed here.
Let's look at what's in the preamble on this point.
I don't think there's much, if I'm recalling.
Well, there's a footnote 5 or 4. And the text at note 4 has a little paragraph about it. So I guess my question is whether or not that paragraph sufficiently alerts agencies to the need to consider their transcript availability policy without having this long provision at the end of the recommendation.
My question is broader than that, and it's Jeff, you're making a good point here, but my question is, what makes this unique to the open proceeding question? This recommendation is about, right, making proceedings open.
It's access to agency proceedings, though. This is part of access.
Well, they already, I mean, I guess I don't know, it's hard for me to not. They have access to agency records that are associated with adjudicative proceedings through FOIA. Now, to the extent FACA requires something more, less, the same.
FACA does require more for FACA meetings because documents that are being considered by the FACA committee have to be shared with the people who are attending, who are observing the meeting. But that's not adjudication. Right. That's not adjudication.
Some adjudications are not transcribed, right? So there's no record to ask for.
Is that right?
Jeremy?
Some parts of adjudications are not transcribed, but
right.
There's always a transcript of an adjudication.
There is for us, I assume for most. I mean, is every aspect of
right. There's always a transcript for
something?
Say, an evidentiary hearing conducted by an administrative law judge or an appeal from such a hearing where there's some sort of oral presentation. I don't think you can say that every settlement conference, pre-hearing conference, scheduling conference, those sorts of things is transcribed. In fact, I think you'd find the opposite more likely, that they're not transcribed.
I mean, I agree with that. And the only thing I would add is it gets back to the question, transcription, recording. I mean, not every proceeding is transcribed. Probably every proceeding of the sort you're talking about is recorded at least. That's a different matter. And the transcript actually might not be prepared unless there's a need for a transcript.
Like judicial review, for example.
Yeah, or an internal appeal. Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, I think that's generally the case, but at our agency, like conference calls, it's at the discretion of the judge to record the call or not. The parties can ask for a copy of the recording. And in my view, the transcript or the recording under FACA may be the same. I know we talked about whether we're litigating it or not. The recording is actually better than the transcript because there's not the possibility of an error in the transcription. And I looked at the model rules of adjudication during the break, and Professor Barnett and the Rules Committee defined administrative record to include the transcript or recording of the hearing and any transcribed or recorded conferences or oral arguments before the adjudicator. I would argue that transcript or recording are one and the same under FACA, but that's a whole issue we probably don't need to get to.
Russell?
I mean, it seems to me we're talking about two separate issues here. One is the availability, quickly or otherwise, of what I'll call non-broadcast items. Transcripts, recordings the agency makes for its own use. And then there's policies governing real-time broadcast items like your Zoom recording. Those are really two separate things, it seems to me. I mean, they're part of the same universe, but my concern was with the latter more than anything else about what you do what an agency, if any, can do. And I don't think, I would think it couldn't do much. But once it puts it out there, once it allows for a real-time broadcast by Zoom or anything else of proceedings, that's it. And my point was the agency ought to understand that in high-profile cases, especially like the one you mentioned, Nadine, the press is going to use it any way they want. They're not, they're not going to broadcast the whole thing. That's for darn sure. But they're going to take out excerpts. People say, well, they'll get it out of context. Well, that's life in the 21st century. Those are the two separate issues. Both of them are complicated, and the question is, to what degree should the recommendation itself try to deal with them? To what degree should it be mentioned more than it is in the preamble? And if so, and I think that Matt's not enthusiastic about this, whether it's to say this is a matter warranting a further examination, something along those lines. And if I would say, if it does come to that, I'd be happy to help with it. I don't know what I could add, but since I contributed to some of the confusion, I'd be happy to continue confusing things.
In light of Russell's comment, I'm going to withdraw my last statement, perhaps that transcripts and recordings are the same. I think recordings are better than transcripts. They're real time, whether it's a Zoom recording or another recording. So, but I would think that recordings would be covered under FACA. I don't know. I kind of like the issue of exploring whether this is, well, I obviously defer to Matt.
Well, it's not.
I kind of think this is fascinating.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if there's a mechanism for maybe Jeremy has thoughts, or Jeff, but I wonder if there's a mechanism for ACUS to address it without, starting a new recommendation project and putting it before the committee and so forth and so on, and then the assembly, of course.
I mean, there's certainly non-recommendation tracks we could consider. I mean, there's always the office of the chairman should consider studying this. Or we
I mean,
could
you could have a little recommendation from, if there are folks here who want to think about this further, you could have a recommendation from a working group. I mean, the model adjudication rules to which Judge McCarthy referred they're not recommendations of ACUS, they're a product of an ACUS working group, so.
Yep.
Well, and can I just echo, I think Russell's point is well taken. You know, in the context of this project, are we talking here in 14 about all adjudicative proceedings, or are we focused on those ones that we are opening to public access and the recordings and transcripts of those proceedings? Or do we mean the entire universe of proceedings, whether they're open or not?
I think that's an excellent point. I mean, our commission meetings are open to the public. They're recorded. If I hold a settlement conference or a pretrial conference with the parties, under our rules, I have the discretion as to whether to record that or not. I never do, absent a party's request to do it, because I think it encourages frank discussion. But that's an excellent point, I think, Nadine. What type of proceeding we're talking about?
Because in your instance, I know your commission has open, under the Sunshine Act, they have open meetings. So
They do, but under paragraph 10 of the Sunshine Act, I don't think they have to, because it's formal adjudication.
that's
So they
right.
don't need to do that, and I've argued with them about it, but I don't think they need to under paragraph 10 of the Sunshine Act, but you're right, they do.
So to the extent, you know, someone can show up and sit there and have a phone?
No.
No.
The agency controls what the recording is. It's the agency, and that brings us full circle to Russell's point. The agency has control, almost in all cases that I'm aware of what can be recorded, who's doing the recording. They have the official recording, and they're very slow in allowing public access to it.
But to answer Nadine's question, though, Social Security closes most of its hearings. It's evidentiary hearings even, right? So those kinds of transcripts would not be made available to the general public.
That's right. I think we're talking only about open hearings. Are we frozen?
No.
No,
But
I think we're all just thinking.
But I think the recommendation can still be worded broadly, because for the closed meetings, they wouldn't have to make them available at all. I mean, so I don't think we just have to say this paragraph only applies to open meetings. There might be some closed meetings where they want to provide it, but
open meetings as in open to the public, or not closed under the Sunshine Act?
well,
Or hearings, like I'm thinking of, you know, our SeaWorld case, where I think there was a limit on who could be present in the courtroom. I mean, there are restrictions, right? And this is what this is all about, is when and under what circumstances should you let anyone show up to what otherwise is a, you know, open forum.
Once you broadcast simultaneously the proceedings, you've opened it is by definition open to everyone. And
what kind of restrictions were there on people attending that hearing?
It might depend on where the hearing's held. Sometimes we borrowed space, and to the extent
Just in terms of size of the
size, capacity, and then
capacity. Okay, that's different.
you know, and then if the press is able to be there, what are they allowed to have in the courtroom?
Yeah, I mean, the issue is when you have capacity restrictions in person, you know, 300 people want to get in, you have 100 seats, you tell 200 people your form of public access is a transcript or recording after the fact.
Judge?
I'm not sure why, if you've simultaneously broadcasted to the public, anything goes. I think in the example of the tweets, the gag order wasn't broad enough. The agency can issue a gag order that circumvents any other official recording or tweeting about the event. Whether they can enforce it is another issue. But I think in the example of the tweets, after they said no other recording, that's not going far enough. The agency didn't take enough steps to say, you know, the agency needs to retain control of this, or at least from the agency's perspective.
Except that, you know, in the pre-Twitter era, people would just leave the meeting and, you know, submit a story to their newspaper or whatever. And that's fine. But so this is just faster. It's you can't block people from talking about the proceeding they just attended.
There's also, just the practicality of the enforcement mechanism. But this is something that Mark and I looked into in the scope of our interviews. And there are, I think, lots of thorny First Amendment issues when you get into restrictions on what people can record. I mean, that might be interesting as a follow-up project, but it's complicated.
Did you run into any circumstances?
Maybe we should go through this recommendation and see if we can live with it as is.
Yeah.
Kai, was that your?
Yes, and you know, with some trepidation since I've been out, but just listening to this, you know, I went back to look at the title. So this is about public access, right? Public access is both if you open it, or you might decide, as we said at some point, you're going to decide whether to open based on whether you're in fact providing transcripts or not. So that's clearly in your head. And now, at least as I read it, it seems pretty straightforward. I'd like the idea of taking out whether they should make, because they should consider how they make it available. That already means they've decided to make it available. And we're not in this recommendation actually telling them those criteria. I don't know if that's what you were discussing, whether you need to add those criteria, which is a whole thing. I think here you can say this is part of public access, and when you think about how you make it accessible, here are these elements, which I think all make a lot of sense.
So other than the change, the whether and, is there anything in that first paragraph giving people pain?
Maybe we need might rather than can.
Mm-hmm. 212, yeah. So let's start with our list. Post in an appropriate location on the website. That's something my agency has done. We don't have a public electronic docket system, but to the extent other agencies might do it that way, I wish Roxanne were on to tell us about the NLRB. They have a wonderful electronic docket system, but
my agency's posted recordings on the website. Problem is, I wanted the recording, I wanted to re-listen to an oral argument.
yeah.
A very contentious one, and it was not posted for like a month.
Yeah.
I also was drafting a decision where in another case where it was, you know, the oral argument in the case they just had would have been relevant to a decision that I would issue. It wasn't available for about a month, which goes to Russell's point.
And you work there. You should be, you're not even a member of the public. You're an insider. And it took a month for you to get it.
Like I said, it's a manpower issue.
Yeah.
So it's insufficient funds to permit somebody to get it up on the website in time, in a timely fashion. And we're way behind the technology here.
Can I just say one thing and then I'll shut up?
No, it's fine.
I promise. I think we're limiting this recommendation too much when all 14 is about is the transcripts and recordings.
Mhm.
This is the thing we were talking about earlier.
Mhm.
Should consider whether to provide real-time, electronic access to the proceedings, and additionally, how they make transcripts and recordings of the proceedings available. Because that phrase I suggested inserting in my awkward way really opens the other prong of these two dimensions here. We're talking about things over which the agency has control, but once it decides to provide, I'll use the term broadcast, Zoom or otherwise, that's going down a different trail. It's really, I don't think anybody's going to say the agency, once it allows anybody who wants to listen to it, then turn around and say, yeah, but you can't broadcast that.
So where would you suggest that language that you just read?
Well,
Put it.
Line, what is it, 210? Consider when to provide real-time, again, somebody can clean this up, real-time access, real-time electronic access, let's put it that, real-time electronic access to proceedings, as well as how to make transcripts and recordings of proceedings, maybe it's access to adjudicative proceedings, as well as how to make transcripts and recordings of those proceedings available to interested members of the public.
But look at recommendation 8.
Okay.
Talks about live streaming. And
Okay. Okay, yeah, well, points well taken. Yeah, I should have looked more closely at that. Somewhere or other, I think it's important to remind agencies that once they allow what 8 suggests they consider whether to allow, that they've lost control of it. And I mean that in a good sense.
so you might want to cross-reference 8 if we're going to say anything like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, that point's well taken. So, as noted in paragraph 8. After consider. Should consider as noted in paragraph 8. I think that's right. Or maybe as noted in paragraph 8 goes where you're going to put it before, because it's peculiar to that phrase. Put it after proceedings.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead, Hi.
Just speak to that. I would, now that we know it's in paragraph 8, I would not put it in here because I think it's really helpful to now, this is a new title, public access to transcript and recordings. It's like 8 told them decide whether you're going to do live streaming. And I think you're right. And I think agencies will know you allow it, it's out, which is the point. This to me is a style thing, that there are lots of things where you could cross-reference other paragraphs and we don't, so that's my feeling. I feel like if we didn't have paragraph 8, I would understand it, but if we do.
I withdraw my suggestion. Highest point is well taken. I didn't pay enough attention to paragraph 8.
Okay, so we're back to how do we want to, what do we want to recommend to agencies that they do in making these available to the public? And this is in any adjudication, open or otherwise. So here's the examples, right? We have A, we've already talked about. B, make transcripts and recordings available on a website not controlled by the agency. I don't see that ever happening, but I welcome discussion.
It's YouTube.
Yeah, state courts do this. I don't think we found any federal agencies that do this. But
Yeah, makes me nervous, but
yep, it should.
but I am a dinosaur, so I will just own that.
I think the issue would come up as agencies that live stream it using YouTube and then forget maybe that it sits there afterwards, unless they've said it's just live streamed and not housed on YouTube.
Which is why we have, but only after weighing the costs and benefits of doing so.
Yep.
Go ahead.
For what it's worth, I loved seeing this. Precisely because, as Nadine, you said, agencies don't really think about it. And if what we're talking about is access, if you're putting it on your website, so it is going to be accessible, I think this is ACUS saying, by the way, you can also put it on a website that's not controlled by you, especially if you don't, I mean, at EOC, to get something on our website, because we had only one person, it was like crazy, as opposed to you learn how to connect to YouTube, you know? So I'd like it that it's there. And you're just saying an agency might, for example, put it on a public website. We're not saying at ACUS that you should or shouldn't. We're saying this can be something you consider.
Would that only be for recordings though, not transcripts?
You can have a transcript on a website. I mean, you're not,
but it's
you're not going to have it on YouTube, but there might
Yeah.
be some other website. Yeah.
Yeah,
I don't
should
know
that
why-
should it just say make recordings? Is that what you're suggesting?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know why you'd put your own transcript on another website. I mean, there's not much bandwidth there to worry about. So, but recordings you might want to leave on YouTube.
Judge McCarthy, did you have a comment on this?
Yes, I heard Kai speak. I think it solves Russell's concern, which is my concern, the untimeliness of making the recording available. And by going out and subcontracting out that work because of the insufficient manpower, they may be able to solve that problem. So I like that.
Jeff's suggestion to take out transcripts in B? And just
I don't
say,
feel strongly about it. It just seems a little awkward to talk about video sharing website for transcripts.
But the reason I thought it made sense still to keep it, Jeff, is you're going to make if you have a transcript, you make it available for public inspection on a website not controlled by the agency, such as a public video sharing website. But that's just a such as if it's a recording. But I think there'll be other websites that might want to have. So I think it's fine to keep transcripts if you have them and you're trying to provide access. It won't be on a public video sharing website, but could be on my website, right? Which I've just set up.
Oh.
You see what I mean? It's like I have a website now, and literally I have it just so I can make available disability materials, LGBT materials. If they want to get something out for public access, say, if you want to put it on your website, here it is. Because it's all about getting it out, amplifying the...
I just think it's interesting to consider how an agency would determine what sites. So for instance, you can go to, I'll just use EEOC and pull it off there, right?
Yes.
And put it on your website.
Yeah.
But to the extent that the agency is affirmatively taking steps to pick which websites they want to post their records as opposed to their own website. I don't know. I think that could be problematic. But.
Yeah, why would they choose to send it to your website as opposed to putting it on their own website?
Yeah. Again, I think these are suggestions for them of what to do. I don't think anyone's going to send something to someone's other website if they're not already planning to put it on their own. This is just back to the judge's point about timeliness, etc. So if you know that there's someone who does like a really good sending out news about some particular agency, you might want, if you're in the communications office of that agency, to tell your person to get that transcript up on the website and also send that transcript to these, 2 or 3 other people that maintain websites and blog posts, whatever. Again, to me, I'm not sure they would do it. It's just sort of more interesting to have them think about it and not be scared about it. You know, and to see this as amplifying their reach.
But the list is has or, not and.
Oh, really? It does.
After D.
Oh, yeah. Well, you don't want that, do you? It's might, for example, this. I think that should just be an and. I mean, they don't have to do all of them, but that's a really good catch. Yeah.
I'm still concerned that the recommendation does not address the timeliness issue. We now have a way to address it, but I'm really concerned about Russell's issue. And I've personally experienced it. Agencies need to be encouraged to get this stuff out there more quickly. How do we address that? That's problematic to me.
That's the last recommendation, right?
Yes.
If you scroll down.
It's how you define timely manner.
Okay. Thank you.
I'm just going to mention that the ABA ad law section uses YouTube for putting up videos of some of their meetings. And it may be just because they don't have enough bandwidth at the ABA to do it.
So do we want to retain transcripts there or take it out? I
don't feel strongly.
Strongly.
So
Okay.
I'll recede to Kai's
I'd like it.
Okay.
website. I'm going to check your website now.
Yeah, chaifeldman.com. But it's only in process at the moment.
Under construction.
Under construction, but
Is it timely though, Kai?
hopefully it will be. I literally, it's like my own library. You know, if I need to find an article or I need to find a reg, I'm just trying it. And then I figure anyone else can use it.
So let's go to C. C is taking it into the real world, right? A room, an office, a place, knocking on the door, let me in. D, which to me is FOIA, but I know we've got FACA in the mix here.
Should CBA? Start with the old-fashioned one first.
Yeah, maybe reorder it. I mean, the time, I guess that's where you get into the timely issue, right? But maybe not, I don't know.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I was going to say no because it makes it sound like we're too much in an old age thing.
Yeah,
but I actually think it's fine because it is moving from, you know, like, okay, we know you might be doing this already, but, you know, so I think it's fine moving it there.
Okay. So we have E and F. Judge Manuel. I think you're on mute.
I'm sorry. I was just wondering if Tom or Russ Wheeler would feel more comfortable in the language of the new F if you were to add the phrase expedited copies or on an expedited basis. Would they, that would add some sense of urgency to a mere request for a transcript?
You're, this would be the court reporter one?
Yes, in E, arrange for a court reporter's transcript under contract to provide expedited copies of such records. Because I agree that sometimes if you put in a request, it still could take days or weeks. Whereas if you, that could add a sense of urgency if that's additional service that could be requested.
Yeah, and I had a question about this. So this is for a court reporter to provide a transcript or recording for free to a member of the public?
Yes.
And so the agency would how do they get paid then? The agency pays it?
Yeah, there's a contract between the agency and the court reporter who acts as under a contract with the agency. We will provide duplication or transcription services for a certain fee, and you go to the court reporter for a transcript.
And that's an individual transaction for each person who wants it?
Believe so.
Or you make an expedited copy available on the website the next day?
Exactly. It's in agency rules. Others on the members of the committee might actually have a better sense of
I think well, I may be talking out of school. I wish Roxanne was here. Back at the NLRB, when I was litigating a big expedited case, under the government contract with the court reporting service, if any party received an expedited copy, the other parties would have to be given the opportunity to receive the same.
But that's the parties, not the public.
Right.
Judge Lesnick, I see you have your hand up.
I want to note that when you ask for an expedited script, the agency has to pay more money. You can get them daily scripts if you want, or during a hearing, or after it's over, get it. If someone says, well, I'd like it expedited, is the agency, should they be under an obligation to spend a large sum of money outside of their normal contract to provide a transcript?
Judge Manuel, did you have a comment here? Yeah.
Yes. Well, how we did it was as a routine matter, of course, we provide it. But if there's an expedited request for an expedited copy, I should say, we just have the law firm, typically is the case, make the payment directly to the court reporters. That's how we do it.
No, and that would work as the agency doesn't have to incur the cost for something that's out of the ordinary for them.
Yeah, no, I mean, obviously the parties are in a different position than the public. So to the extent that the public either can't find it on a website or doesn't get it through FOIA and they want to get it through a court reporter, the court reporter is going to charge them. And the question is whether the agency pays for that. Right? I mean, I guess, Jeremy, you're saying some agencies do that.
At least according to regulations. Again, how it works in practice.
Yeah, okay.
You know, even though there is a request to have the transcript expedited, there's often pushback from the court reporting service that, yeah, they'll expedite it quicker than 2 weeks, but it's still going to take us 3 to 5 days to get it to you. And again, it's a manpower situation.
I just note that if you broadcast the proceedings, a lot of this goes away. Because you're not worried about transcripts then because it's out there and you don't have to pay a court reporter, to transcribe it and put 2 words in each line the way they do and that kind of thing.
Russell, I'm all for this real-time stuff. I'm with you.
I know you are. Good ally.
You still might need a transcript later on in the proceeding, for judicial review or something.
You might, but the reporter, she's interested in getting something up on the evening news. If that's not an anachronism,
yeah,
and that's not her concern.
Judge Manuel, did you have another comment?
No, I disagree with the comments that are being made. It's really is a question of timing and who pays, and in the real world, in my experience, if you want something done faster or quickly, you just pay for it. And I don't know if this language here makes that ambiguous as to who's paying for it, but maybe that could be clarified.
Well, it says an agency might, for example, arrange for court reporters at no cost. And this is for the public, not the parties.
Right, but expedited seems to me should get a different treatment. For instance, if the person puts in a FOIA request and is willing to wait for weeks, that typically would be provided at no cost. But if a reporter wants to get an expedited copy immediately, that's something it seems to me where they ought to incur the expense.
Why did you say for an additional cost there instead of at no cost?
I agree. If you want it expedited, you should pay for it. But we should encourage what Russell says, real-time broadcasting of it all.
Well, Can I make a comment about that?
Sure.
When you have a real-time broadcast and say someone transcribes it on their own, what is the official transcription then? Generally, the judge insists on getting a copy, going over it, making sure it's accurate. The parties can say, I thought I heard this said, or I thought this happened, but it's up to the maker of the record, which is the judge. If people are recording in the pews or they're doing their own recording, who determines what is the official record?
I think we talked about that, Bob and Judge, and I think we talked about the fact that the agency determines it, and I was expressing a preference for recording over transcription because you don't have to wait and there's no errors in the transcription.
Yeah, that's a good point, Tom. There have been examples of transcripts that were not accurate and that may even have been certified as accurate. But when they've gone back over it, have found that, it just can be a matter of interpreting the language or some other reason. But recordings and transcripts are not always synonymous.
So
But there are circumstances in which the recording from the court reporter or from someone in the public or something publicly broadcast in which there is dispute over what the language is. It's garbled or uncertain, and the parties may argue over what it should have been, and you need someone to decide and make a final decision, and that would be the trial court judge or the trier of fact. So again, I'm not opposed to Mr. Willer's view of trying to have all these things open to the public, but still be sure that you don't lose control of what is the official record.
Absolutely, yes.
My only concern, your point is well taken, Judge. My only concern is a narrow one. It's about the reporters who are covering the proceedings, especially high visibility proceedings, which case what they transcribed is going to be of play no role in what's the official transcript. They just want to get access to it real quick so they can use it in their reports.
Well, let me say, I once testified as the character witness in a criminal case, a move for which I don't advise other judges to do, but it turned out well. But as I went back to the pew and I'm sitting, my phone buzzes and I'm being sent emails that court reporters sitting next to me had already written articles to the press as to what Judge Lusnik had just testified to. First time it ever happened to me. This is going back 10 years, but scared me, by the way, although I should have been more scared enough that I didn't do what I did. But at any rate, yes, you're right. They just wanted to get it out. And were they accurate? Well, I could tell you now, those newspaper articles are still out there. No one has the transcript, but the newspaper articles are still out there as what everybody would accept as what happened at that hearing. Anyway, sorry for the tangent.
No, but I think that tangent brings out the failure of the adjudicator to retain control. And I don't think anybody disagrees with you, Judge, that the agency needs to retain control.
So on the list, are we fine with the list as is, including E, which puts on agencies the possibility of paying for copies for the public?
I'm sorry, the agency pays for the cost?
Well, it said at no cost to the requester, but now it says for an additional cost. But I think that was to indicate expedited. But originally the language said at no cost. Are we changing that then?
I'm gonna have to defer to Jeff on FACA, but I agree with Judge Manuel that if it's expedited, there should be a cost imposed. FACA doesn't address that, I don't believe.
So this will only talk about expedited copies, not copies in general, as drafted now.
To distinguish it from D.
Well, okay.
Well,
So, but
although I'm not sure why E has arranged for court reporters and D doesn't, I mean, you might want to have a court reporter for D as well. So
D
these
was
two-
getting at the situation where the agency itself provides access to the transcript, whereas E is an agency saying, go ask the court reporter for a transcript. But I
Okay.
suppose provide copies of transcripts could include.
Yeah, so could we strike E?
And say something at the end of D on no more than the actual cost of duplication on, you know, unless some special request for expedited copies. I mean, do we want to say anything about expedited copies?
Hi.
It seemed like the idea of an expedited copy was important. And then I think you simply make D and E the same with the difference of expedited copies and an additional cost. In other words, so D is provide copies of transcripts and recordings on request, whether it's the agency that did it or a court reporter, right? At no cost. Oh, I see. That's why you have the court reporter, because it makes sense at no cost if the agency did it, as opposed to the agency, as opposed to a court reporter. That was the difference, Jeremy, as you just said. D, it was no cost because it's just the agency.
The concern with FACA is that agencies were shifting the burden for paying for transcripts from themselves to the parties by saying, we're not paying for this. We'll pay a small fee for transcripts. The parties will then pay to get transcripts from the court reporter. Therefore, we don't have to fully compensate the court reporter. The parties are now paying for this as well. So FACA is structured to avoid a sort of end run around the requirement that transcripts be provided at the actual cost of duplication. The alternative would have been, or you can go pay whatever the court reporter charges you. I don't know if that makes sense, but that was the idea. That the same D and E should both provide either of those processes. An agency could easily adopt either of those processes, whichever process they adopt. That shouldn't actually affect the cost to a party or a member of the public of obtaining a transcript.
Okay.
Unless it's an expedited request.
Unless it's expedited, yes.
Which, Jeremy, you didn't have in your piece before. So I think, it's your D is provided at no cost or for no more than the actual cost, right? E is, even if you've used a court reporter, you cannot, move that fee over. So it actually, E completely tracks D without the expedited, okay? And then you've got an F, arrange for expedited copies of such records on request for an additional cost or for a fee that's no more than the actual, if you want to keep that in. But I think I think D and E should mirror each other with the difference just being court reporter based on what you've said, Jeremy, and then a new app. So the only thing you need to take out is expedited. Don't accept changes, take out your, take out that expedited, take out for an additional, go back to no cost, etc. And then same thing, or for a fee, keep all that, and then make an F. And arrange for transcripts and recordings
Expedited.
on an expedited basis.
On request. I mean, it's only if someone's
On
asked.
request, yes. On request.
That does it for me, Judge Manuel. Does that do it for you? I think that's great.
Yeah, it at least affords them the option.
Well, I think.
But you need to add, at whatever
Provide.
you had before, add an additional cost to the requester
Yeah.
or for a fee that is no more than the actual cost. I mean, but that's making your point. The style Community
can fiddle with
South
the
is going to
language.
fix that a little.
Yeah, we can fiddle with the language. The
Yeah.
idea is there.
We are just about out of time. And I think we
Only-
just have the last two,
Mhm.
and we have not touched the preamble, which I was hopeful we would get to. Are there anything, I mean, 15, I think is pretty self-explanatory and it's going to happen. The Privacy Act requires us to take that into account. But then we're left with our timely issue.
Why don't we switch 15 and 16?
I think that's right.
It almost feels like it should come first, to be honest, because it's about providing before you provide public access. But Russell?
Oh, I was just gonna say, now's not the time, but I'd like to send to Jeremy some suggested language for what's now 15 and also for 8 to cover my parochial concerns about the reporters. But I don't want to take up time doing it now.
Okay. Judge Manuel, did you have one last point before we adjourn? Okay. All right. It's as good a point as any to stop, I suppose. And we'll be revisit some of this, including the preamble at the next meeting, and the date has escaped me. Jeremy.
To be announced.
Okay. That's why it escapes me.
Exactly.
I don't know it. Okay. Any closing thoughts, Jeremy, that I need to?
Not from me.
Not from you?
Not from
Okay.
me.
All right, great. I think this was very productive, very helpful. We've made some good progress. I am optimistic that we'll breeze through this at the next meeting. It is now 4:01 on a Friday afternoon. Time for happy hour, hopefully, for some of you. Not too much work left. Thanks again for everything. We really appreciate your support and contributions here.
Thanks, Nadine. Really nice job. Thank you.
Thank you, Nadine.